Hello and welcome to a special Halloween edition of Spooky Stitches. My name is Sheena Peril and this is my second attempt at recording. If you're new to the channel, thank you for stopping by. We're doing a little bit different format this week. Normally this is a knitting podcast with a spooky story at the end, but this week in honor of Halloween, we are just doing the spooky story. If you enjoy this episode, you might want to hit the subscribe button. You can also check me out on all of the social media links down below and also on my website where I post weekly about knitting, writing, history, and all sorts of other things. To my returning viewers, thank you so much for joining me, especially my patrons. You guys have been such a big help to me in the last couple of weeks. You guys know I've been struggling. So thank you for stopping by, and I hope that you enjoy this special episode. Anyway, it is time to turn down the lights and go on to our spooky tale. This week, the podcast is diving into its first foray into true crime, and as you have probably gathered from the title, we are looking at the Lizzie Borden case. A few general warnings have to go along with this one. It was a very brutal murder. So if you're a little squeamish, you might want to skip this one. And also, because of the time when this happened, there's a lot of very casual racism, sexism, classism, all the isms that we like to avoid today. So just be aware of that going into this case. If you don't want to hear that kind of thing, then just go ahead, skip on to the next episode. I have plenty of other podcasts that you can listen to right over here or possibly over here. I'm not sure. And then we'll just see you in the next one. But if you're willing to put up with all of that, buckle up because here we go. So something that immediately drew me to this case, and one of the reasons why I feel sort of kinship with Lizzie and her sister Emma, is because of their family situation. Their mother died when Emma was 14 and Lizzie was just 5, and their father remarried rather quickly. This wasn't uncommon at the time. Men would just not be caring for their own children, especially well-off men like Andrew Borden. And it was just de rigueur to be married at the time. So he went ahead and got a second wife named Abby, mostly just to help him care for the children and for the household. Now, Emma hated their new stepmother from the word go. Lizzie seemed to get along with her well enough at first, but the distance between them grew as she got older. It's unclear if Emma turned her against Abby or if it was something that Abby did that made them part ways emotionally, or if it was just Lizzie growing up and changing her opinions. Is it possible that Lizzie, a young child without a mother, discovered that the person that she had come to trust as a new member of her household turned out to not be as caring as she had once thought? We don't know. So the parents and the girls grew more and more distant from each other as they aged. At the time of the murders, girls were established spinsters. They were definitely women at this time. Emma was 41 and Lizzie was 32. I haven't come across any reason why neither of them ever married. Lack of interest. Did their father drive off suitors? I don't know. What we do know is that the house got more and more tense by the day with all 4 of them living there. Now, let's talk about Andrew Borden for a minute because I feel like he holds the key to this case. He was not a cuddly kind of man. He was very wealthy. He'd worked his way up from near poverty. As a result, he was extremely tight-fisted. He counted his pennies and he counted them again. He was not interested in spending money, but on earning interest on his money. As a result, even though they were basically millionaires by the standards of the time, the only luxury in the Borden home was a single flush toilet in the basement with a cold water sink. There was no hot water, no gas, no electricity, no telephone. Their house wasn't in a fashionable neighborhood. It was adjacent to the shopping district. In a town where Protestants had the money and power, the Bordens called Catholics, Jews, and other European immigrants neighbors. They kept only one servant, a maid of all work, who we'll get to in a minute. And something I find very telling is that this is an upper class family. But the way the upstairs of the house was set up, there were no hallways. All of the bedrooms were interconnected. For Andrew, Abby, and Emma to get to their rooms from the main staircase, they all had to walk through Lizzie's room. I don't know about you, but that would drive me absolutely crazy. And at the very least, I would think that a family with that kind of wealth could afford for each member of the family to have a private bedroom. That's not asking for a lot. And if they were poor and living in a crowded city like New York or Boston, then yeah, it would be pretty common to have somebody sleeping in the hallway or in the kitchen or in the parlor or whatever. But this is a well-off family, and that was just very strange. So this house had once been tenements. So it basically was a house that was built as a duplex, and then it was turned back into a single family home. So that leads to some weirdness in the floor plan, which we will talk more about later. The house only had one small parlor, so Lizzie and Emma, when they had guests over, would usually entertain in the guest bedroom upstairs, which in itself is very strange. Like inviting someone into a bedroom to entertain, even nowadays, that's kind of weird, but back then it would be very strange. Um, it, I mean, bedrooms are a very private place. You wouldn't want someone that you're only acquaintances with to be in a bedroom. So, because of the layout of the house, they did not entertain. There were no fancy dinners, no dances, no group entertainments. Speaking of being tight fisted, both Lizzie and Emma did receive allowances, but these were less than the women working in the local textile factories made, about $4 a week. And the textile workers were notoriously underpaid. So the fact that they're making even less than that is really shocking. And so while their friends were able to charge furs and jewelry and silk dresses to their accounts without a worry, Lizzie and Emma, even when they went out of the house, were still living at a lower standard than their social and economic peers. And to make matters worse, like I said, the house made it so that they couldn't entertain. They couldn't have the big soirees like their friends or the big teas or anything like that. And in 1892, there was a very complex dance of calls and returning calls. You would go to see someone, and then they were supposed to return the visit within so many days. And it was just very complex social rules that they had to obey. And the way that their house, both socially and physically, was set up did not allow them to partake in that. So it's entirely possible that one of the reasons why they didn't get married is because they just never met anybody. They were never in the right place at the right time because of their social isolation. And they were very socially isolated. They relied on their church for all interaction in the community. And even then, it was just because charity work was one of the few outlets that women of their class could take part in. So it's a really tough situation, and one that I really relate to, having been in that enforced isolation before. So the last thing that I want to mention about the house and about Andrew Borden is that he was known for locking the women into the house when he left for work. Now, I've seen conflicting things about this. I've seen some statements that the door could only be locked and unlocked from outside and that Andrew kept the only key, but then the maid seemed to be able to go in and out at will, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. I've also read that he would just lock the door behind him the way that we do today. So that kind of conflicts with it. I don't know which one is true. If it was the former, then I would say that definitely gives anyone in the household a bit of a motive because they're effectively being held captive in their own home. But honestly, I think that the latter is probably more likely. Next, let's look at Abby Borden. She was a middle-class woman already determined to be a spinster when Andrew Borden asked her to marry him. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It almost seems like he just kind of bumped into her one day and asked her to marry him the way you might ask someone if they know what time it is. Abby didn't have any prospects. She was just living at home with her family, so she said yes and signed on for basically being a glorified housekeeper to a cold, distant husband and his verbally abusive daughters. So she was not in a great situation either. From reports at the time, Abby was probably the nicest, most affectionate person in the household. And again, it's unclear why she was loathed so much by her stepdaughters. It might have just been the typical anger and hurt that comes with having a step parent appear out of nowhere, because Lizzie and Emma probably didn't get a lot of warning or input in the fact that their father was getting remarried. She probably just moved in, and that was how they found out. Maybe they had a few days' notice, but that's the way it was in the Borden household. The last regular member of the household was Bridget Sullivan, the maid. Bridget was an Irish immigrant. She was responsible for doing most of the household chores, although the Borden women also did chores like ironing, mending, making beds, that kind of thing. Bridget took on the heavier tasks like laundry, cooking, and washing windows, all of which were a lot more labor intensive than they are today. All of the Bordens referred to Bridget as Maggie, which was the name of their previous maid. This insulting lack of respect was honestly not that uncommon. I've read of many Victorian and Edwardian households that would just make up a name for household staff so they didn't have to learn new names when they inevitably quit. Considering how irrationally enraged I get every time someone messes up my name, I'm pretty sure Bridget had some pent-up anger in there, and Lizzie, Emma, and Andrew could not have been easy employers. According to Bridget's testimony at the trial, the only reason she stayed on with the Bordens was because of Abby, whom she described as a kind, decent woman and the nicest in the family. Now, August 4th, the day of the murders, was unusual because Lizzie and Bridget's maternal uncle John showed up the night before. He was visiting other relatives in the area and asked to stay with the family. The suddenness of his arrival threw suspicion on him at the trial. Why would he stay with the Bordens when his sister, Lizzie and Emma's mother, had been dead for many years, and when Andrew had already remarried? Why not stay with other family that he had come purposefully to see? But we'll get a little bit more into that in a minute. Lastly, I do want to insert a picture of the house right here. This is the layout of the second floor, so you can see what I mean about the weirdness of the layout of the second floor. You know, Abby and Andrew were able to access their bedroom by using the back staircase, the servant's staircase, so to speak. But Emma would have to walk through her sister's room, and because Lizzie was on such poor terms with her parents, she did move her bed to block the door connecting their rooms. And as you can actually see from the layout, Abby and Andrew had also moved like a dresser or something to block it from the other side, so they definitely did not want cross-contamination between their rooms. These floor plans come from the Lizzie Andrew Borden Virtual Museum, which I have linked down below. Mostly I just wanted to look at the second floor of the home because it's the most complicated, but if you follow the links, then they will show you the whole house, including basement, attic, yard, and the barn. I am going to mention the attic just briefly because apparently when Uncle John came, he would sometimes sleep in the guest room, but sometimes he would sleep in an unfinished guest room in the attic on the same floor where Bridget had her bedroom. We don't know why he would do this when there was a perfectly good guest room, and we don't know why he slept in the guest room on this particular occasion. Now, August 4th started out as just another humid, sweltering summer day in Massachusetts. Andrew Borden left for work at his usual time. There had been some minor thefts from the room he shared with Abby, so it became a habit for him to leave the bedroom key on the mantel in the parlor in plain view of everyone, daring the thief to try again. According to family members, neighbors, and even the police who investigated the thefts, Lizzie was a strong suspect, but Andrew Borden never pushed the matter. When Lizzie developed a habit of kleptomania, he told the police and local shopkeepers to just stop arresting her and to send him the bill. Apparently, she wasn't good at hiding her sticky fingers or just plain didn't care. Advertising her crimes would certainly be one way to get back at her tight fisted father. At any rate, Lizzie ignored any rumors about her and instead used her bed to block the door, like I mentioned. Andrew left, leaving the doors locked behind him. Abby Borden told Bridget to wash the outside windows and then went about her own tasks upstairs. Emma was out of town visiting a friend, so she wasn't even home at the time. Lizzie went out to the barn for some fresh air. The house was surrounded by pear trees and grapevines, and she took several pears up to the loft for a snack. Among his tight-fisted habits, Andrew would not allow food to be thrown away, which resulted in the entire family getting low-grade food poisoning from a combination of old swordfish, bad milk, and week-old mutton stew that they'd been consuming for the last day and a half. Abby and Andrew had the mutton for breakfast, but Lizzie dined alone and had some cookies and coffee, probably still not feeling well from the night before. It was, in fact, habit for the sisters to dine separately from their parents. There was that much animosity built up in the house. Bridget was also not feeling well, and after completing the outside windows, she went up to her room to lay down for a little while. Lizzie took her pears up to the loft to eat, something she said took about 20 minutes or so, but her testimony is vague at best for reasons we'll see later. Her conflicting testimony places her alternately upstairs, in the barn, in the kitchen, and in the dining room when Andrew Borden came home unusually early thanks to his own bout of food poisoning. He came home around 11 a.m. and felt badly enough that he lay down on the couch in the living room for a short nap. When she talked to the police that afternoon, Lizzie claimed that she came inside because she heard an odd sound. That was when she discovered her father's butchered body. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't run for help. Instead, she calmly went to the side door, looking through the screen. Across the street, a neighbor saw her and asked what was the matter, to which she replied, "Do come over, someone has murdered father." The neighbor came over to find Andrew Borden's face smashed to bits on the sitting room sofa. Lizzie sent Bridget for the family doctor, but he was out. There were 2 other doctors nearby, but they were not of the same social standing as the Bordens. It could be that Lizzie didn't know she had 2 doctors nearby she could have called because she just didn't associate with them, or she could have just been in a panic and forgot because they weren't part of her regular social circle. Or the whole thing could have been a ruse. Either way, no one sent for the Catholic doctor next door or for the Jewish doctor down the street. Instead, Lizzie sent Bridget for one of her female friends, telling her to come quickly, but not the reason. The first neighbor Lizzie spoke to, Mrs. Churchill, had a telephone. After ascertaining that Mr. Borden was clearly dead, she called the police. When the police finally came and began conducting interviews and searches, they discovered that Abby Borden was in a similar state upstairs, attacked from behind and laying face down on the guest room floor. Through all of this, Lizzie's story changed and often didn't make sense, stating that Abby had gone out earlier in the day after receiving a note that no one could find and no one could identify, and then a mysterious return in the middle of the police search that only Lizzie noticed. Abby's body was cold, implying that she died well before Andrew. Eventually, it was determined that there was about a 90-minute gap between the murders. These contradictions and her general emotionless state led the police to arrest Lizzie a few days later. Afterward, it came out that from the moment the doctor finally arrived, Lizzie was treated with morphine, which could explain her memory lapses, confused story, and general confusion during the trial, as well as her flat countenance. Among the evidence pointing at Lizzie was an attempt by her to buy cyanide a few days before the murders, though she claimed it was for cleaning a sealskin. I'm going to disagree with this here because there are no records of cyanide being used in any form to clean furs, because cyanide stains things blue, so that just doesn't make sense. Arsenic was commonly used to clean and preserve furs, but that's not what she asked for. There was some confusion about if the woman who asked for the cyanide solution was actually Lizzie, but after a lot of back and forth and at least 3 different witnesses being called from the pharmacy, it was determined that it was Lizzie, though she flatly denied it. In the basement, a broken hatchet was found covered in ash. The police theorized that the handle broke during the attacks, and the cleaned blade was then covered in ash to make it look like it had been in the basement for a while. Also in the basement was a bucket of bloody rags. This would have been in the vicinity of the only flushing toilet in the house, so Lizzie's excuse of being on her period makes sense. But Bridget claimed they hadn't been there previously, and that she certainly would have washed them if she knew they were there. Lastly, before her arrest, Lizzie burned a dress, claiming that it was stained with paint. If she was the killer, she wasn't particularly good at covering up for herself, because she did this in front of her sister and a friend and the maid. Both Emma and Lizzie's seamstress testified that it was, in fact, paint on the dress and that it was Emma's idea to burn it. In the end, without modern forensics, the prosecution was left with a great deal of circumstantial evidence, a lot of it boiling down to Lizzie's odd behavior and confused answers to questions on the stand. After 10 months in jail, she was finally acquitted due to the lack of physical evidence. There are a lot of theories in this case. At the time, the popular theory, other than Lizzie herself committing the crime, was that it was an outsider, someone of low income with an accent, and just about every immigrant for miles was hauled in, questioned, and eventually let go. Lizzie and Emma both vouched for several local workmen who had been seen in or near the house in the weeks before the murders. I'm going to look at a few of the most popular theories here and then poke some holes in them before we move on to the hauntings. You didn't think I'd skip the hauntings in a podcast called Spooky Stitches, did you? First, Lizzie pointed the finger at someone her father had business dealings with that had soured, possibly over a rent issue. But neither sister could identify the individual, so they were never tracked down. Second, let's look at the idea that it was Lizzie acting on her own. For this to work, she would have had to murder Abby around 9:30 a.m. without making any noise Bridget might hear. Then she would have had to clean herself up, change clothes, wait for her father to come home, silently murder him, clean up and change clothes again, and then get Mrs. Churchill's attention across the street by about 11:10. Remember, Andrew came home around 11 a.m., and according to police, he was murdered within 15 minutes of laying down for his nap. Mrs. Churchill says that it was about 11:10 when she's talked to Lizzie. Personally, I find this to be very unbelievable. While Lizzie was stronger and fitter than most women her age and station since she had to do her own household chores, this would have been quite strenuous. Second, even if she murdered them in the nude, as some people have suggested, she would still have blood in her hair, under her nails, potentially in her ears. So many little places that she might not even notice at first. This would be a messy, messy job. I am, in fact, shocked that the murderer didn't leave footprints as they left the crime scene. There was blood on the ceilings, for crying out loud. You can't tell me that it wouldn't have gotten into the perpetrator's face and their hair. Even if someone helped her clean up and change clothes, there's no way they could do all of that and commit murder in under 10 minutes. Second, she would have had to go through 3 different outfits in 2 hours. Bridget would definitely notice, and she insisted at the trial that Lizzie did not change clothes even once. Third, I don't think Lizzie would have been able to do it quietly. Whether from rage or exertion, she would have cried out, gasped, panted, screamed. For that matter, her victims would have cried out, because we know the first blows didn't immediately kill them. Yes, they died before the attack was over, but there was a second when they could have screamed or cried out. The third theory is that Lizzie and Emma worked together, with Emma sneaking home from her friend's house to kill one or both of their parents. Again, I don't buy it, and not just because Emma has a solid alibi. The fourth theory is that Lizzie and her uncle worked together. John had been under a shadow of suspicion because of his sudden arrival. Was the trip planned in advance? We don't know. If it was, he only told Andrew, who didn't bother to inform the family, according to Lizzie and Emma. In this theory, Lizzie acts as a lookout while her uncle commits the murders. But we know that John didn't bring any luggage, which means he only had the clothes on his back. So did he commit the murder in the nude, like a lot of Lizzie theorists suggest? Or did he change into clothing Lizzie provided for him, possibly from Andrew's closet? We don't know even if John and Andrew were close in size, so it's hard to say. And after the trial, there's no real mention of John. Did he stay in contact with his nieces? If they did, I couldn't find any information during my research for this episode. The fifth theory is that Bridget and Lizzie worked together, possibly because they were in an intimate relationship. Well, I would 100% buy that Lizzie was either a lesbian or bisexual. I don't buy that she would be in a relationship with a servant, an immigrant, and a woman that she couldn't even be bothered to call by her real name. Lizzie and Emma were many things, and pretty high up on that list were classist bitches. So this one's pretty hard to swallow, at least from a romance angle. The last popular theory I want to discuss is the bastard brother theory. In this one, Andrew has an illegitimate son from around the time of his first marriage named William. There are no birth records for William to prove this theory, but there are two good reasons for this. Number one, birth certificates weren't required until after World War II, and second, if you had a kid out of wedlock, most mothers just wouldn't bother filling out the birth record because in most cases they couldn't or didn't want to fill out the father's information. So this one is iffy, but it hasn't been shot to pieces yet. The idea is that Lizzie lets in her half-brother, who may or may not have been the potential renter Andrew quarreled with earlier in the week, and acts as a lookout before helping him escape the home. Again, maybe in some of Andrew's clothes, or he could have brought his own. Either way, he is not wandering around 2nd Street in Fall River at noon covered in blood. This theory could also potentially explain why the murder weapon wasn't conclusively found. William could walk up to the home with a toolbox containing a hatchet and a change of clothes, commit the murders, and then walk away in clean clothes with his toolbox, potentially with no one the wiser. It's true that no one saw workmen in the area that day, but if not covered in blood, he would have blended in on the street. After all, they are in the commercial district of the neighborhood, and there would have been a lot of middle-class, working-class people around. He could have easily slipped out through the cellar door, hopped a fence, and snuck back onto the street. My personal opinion is that Lizzie, Emma, and Bridget worked together to varying degrees, and that William or another lower to middle class person worked with them. I think Emma was the mastermind, Lizzie became the scapegoat because she was home and had the most obvious motive, and Bridget helped with the cover-up. Bridget was written off as a suspect early in the investigation because if she killed her employers, she'd be out of a job. But Bridget was not treated well, and she had to work in a house full of animosity. I think she was offered money to help them cover up the crime and then misdirect the investigation. And in return, Emma and Lizzie would make sure she wasn't prosecuted, since a lower-class woman would be much more vulnerable. Lizzie's station gave her a measure of protection in the courts. Most people believe she wasn't physically strong enough to commit the murders, and all through her time in jail, she had her meals brought in from the local hotel, was allowed to decorate her cell, and even had a pet cat. She was friends with the matron and stayed in her apartment. None of these luxuries would have been afforded to Bridget, who is physically stronger as a servant, and being of Irish immigrant stock and a lower class, would have had a target on her back were she arrested. Because Lizzie was the one arrested, suffragist and women's rights causes took up her name, demanding her release and proclaiming her innocence. The court of public opinion cleared her long before the judge did. Emma was the sister on the outside because she had better social skills than her sister. She was better at drumming up support and making friends. Lizzie, to my eye, had mental health issues. I'm not saying these are why she committed murder, if she did, but that they probably contributed to the choice to arrest her. Her flat countenance in many of her photos and in descriptions could be attributed to anything from a depressive episode to autism to schizophrenia, but none of them would have had effective treatments or accommodations at the time, or even diagnoses. So they would have been stigmatized. This could also explain some of her confusion during questioning and the way she repeatedly said she didn't understand the questions put to her or answered in such a literal way to frustrate the prosecution. Much of Lizzie's physical behavior in court, such as covering her face with her fan during certain testimonies, was dictated by her defense team. I think Bridget and any other accomplices were paid off. Bridget basically disappears from public record after the trial when she moves to Montana, and we don't know what happens to John, and of course there's no records one way or another about William, meaning all of them could have been involved to some degree. All three of them would have had motive for killing both Abby and Andrew, who was not a popular man with anyone. But as I said, this is just my personal theory. The crux of the issue is we don't know a lot about any of the Bordens prior to the murder. When it comes to personalities, hobbies, medical histories, interests, and just general personal details, everything we know comes from the trial documents. If Andrew and Abby hadn't been murdered, the Bordens would have vanished into obscurity. And considering what a high-stress time the trial was, I don't think you can really judge a person's character just on that. Now that we've gotten through the murders and the theories, let's talk about some ghosts. Andrew Borden came from a poorer branch of a well-off family. His grandfather was wealthy and left most of his money to his elder son. Andrew's father was the younger son. His grandfather owned a lot of land and buildings, including the house on 2nd Street that we know as the Lizzie Borden house, and the house next door. Andrew's uncle lived there with his wife and children. Unfortunately, a fire burned the home to the ground, killing the children and their mother. In another version of the story, the mother, suffering from postpartum depression, threw her 3 children down a well before slitting her own throat. Only one of the children survived. I honestly don't know which is the truth, if either. It does, however, point to a possibility of mental illness running in the family. Several items from that home were moved into Lizzie and Andrew's home, some while the family was still alive, some after the fact. There are toys in the attic that the spectral children of Andrew's young cousins are said to play with at night, and sounds of playing and laughter can be heard in the attic and on the stairs. The toys appear to move on their own if they're left for very long. Secondly, and most obviously, the ghosts of Andrew and Abby are said to haunt the home. Footsteps can be heard going up and down stairs, along with the jingling of keys. Lights flicker, and it's said that Andrew is still a skinflint in death, demanding payment from guests. Apparitions have been spotted, male voices are heard, and closing doors all make the house just as spooky now as it was the day of the murders. In addition, guests staying at the now bed and breakfast have felt people touching their bedding and legs as they try to sleep. Lizzie's room is perhaps more threatening than the room where the actual murders occurred. Guests here have woken up feeling like someone is trying to choke them, and this is attributed to the former occupant's murderous spirit. By contrast, some say that Lizzie's spirit never came back to the house on 2nd Street at all, which had held so much animosity and bad memories for her. I wouldn't want to spend my afterlife there. According to them, Lizzie still resides at Maplecroft, a large house on the hill that she and her sister purchased after the trial. Orbs and apparitions have been spotted at Maplecroft, which is currently not open to the public. They've been trying to open it as a B&B for a while, but there's some zoning laws, and I think it's either open for special events or just fully closed to the public now. Either way, it's a gorgeous house. You should check it out online. Writing and knitting retreat, anyone? And that is the Lizzie Borden house, ghosts, and murders. I hope you enjoyed this episode, even though I had to consolidate a lot of information down and skipped over a lot of things. Still, this is a really fascinating case with a lot of unanswered questions. So what do you think? What's your favorite theory? Would you be willing to stay at either the house on 2nd Street or at Maplecroft? What about the infamous guest room? Thank you so much for joining me. If you have suggestions for future spooky tales or a ghost story of your own that you would like to share with the podcast, please send it to me. My contact information is listed down below. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope you have something cute and fluffy to cuddle with.